All right, today we talk about section 6.2, which is properties of parallelograms. And our goal is just to use the properties to find some missing angles and missing sides. So a parallelogram is going to be a quadrilateral, meaning it has four sides. So a quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. Quadrilateral with both pairs of opposite sides parallel. If I wanted to do a sketch, typically we're going to see them a little bit tilted. Okay, and then opposite sides parallel. Remember, we mark parallel with little arrows or triangles on our figure. And I'm marking this set over here different than my first set because these lines here go a different direction than these lines here. Okay, one property of a parallelogram, so if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, if the opposite sides are parallel, then the opposite sides are also going to be congruent. That means that this side QP is going to be congruent to RS, meaning they're the same measure. QR is also going to have the same measure as PS, so that's what it means the opposite sides are congruent. The first example problem, JKLM is a parallelogram, and it says find JK and KL. So JK will actually be the same as ML, and since ML measures 6, that means this side is 6. Okay, JM is 4, it's congruent to KL, so that means KL also has to be 4. So not much for solving there, just knowing the property. On this diagram, if ML is 10, it's going to be the same as JK because those are the opposite sides, so this side over here is 10. JM is opposite of KL, which means these two pieces are congruent, so this side length is 15 over here. Okay, then we have properties that deal with the angles of the parallelogram, and the first one says if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then its opposite angles are congruent. Okay, so if I look at this figure, the opposite angles would be like angle Q is congruent to angle S. Angle P is congruent to angle R. Okay, so that's one of our new properties. The other property that deals with the angles is if the quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then the consecutive angles are supplementary. Now, another word for consecutive, we called those the same side interior angles earlier this year. So same side interiors. We'll just say that they equal to 180. That's what supplementary means. So consecutive would just mean like angle P and angle S. They're on the same segment. They're next to each other. They're consecutive. Angle R and angle S, they're on the same segment. They're next to each other. They're consecutive. Okay. So these two angles right here have to total to 180. These two angles right here have to total to 180. These two angles would total to 180. And these two angles would total to 180. 180 is all around. Okay, so we know opposite angles are congruent. That's why this is X and Y. Angles that are next to each other, the consecutive ones or the same side interiors, have to equal to 180. So it says WXYZ is a parallelogram. Find the missing angle measures. Okay, if I know angle Z is 105, I can say, well, the opposite angle has the same measure because they are congruent. So this angle right here is 105. Any two angles that are consecutive have to total to 180. So I'm going to say 180 minus 105. I'm left with 75 degrees. And if angle Y is 75 degrees, that means angle W has to be 75 degrees as well. Okay, same idea with number 4. If angle X is 50, where else can I fill in the 50? Well, the opposite angle would be angle Z, so that's going to be 50. If I want to find any other angle, I'm going to subtract from 180, and I'm going to be left with 130 degrees. So 130 here and 130 here. Okay. Down at the bottom, I'm going to ask, well, what property are we actually using, and then solve. Okay, so like this one here, are they labeling sides? Are they labeling angles? They're labeling sides, and we know that these opposite sides are going to be congruent. So if the opposite sides are congruent, we're just going to say 5x minus 10 has to be equal to 20. To solve, I would add 10 to both sides. And I get 5x is equal to 30, and when I divide by 5, I'm going to find that x is equal to 6 for this problem. Okay, on the next one, they're giving us a pair of angles, so I would ask you, are these the opposite angles, or are they consecutive angles? Well, these are actually opposite because they're across from each other, so we say the opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. That means that 4x minus 20 has to be equal to 100. I would add the 20 to both sides, and then I have 4x is equal to 120. When I divide by 4, I'm going to find that x is equal to 30. Okay, On number 7, this is the two angles next to each other, so we call them consecutive angles or same side interior angles. Okay, consecutive angles have to equal to 180. So here I have 5x plus 75 is or plus 3x plus 25 has to equal to 180. If I add them together, I get 8x plus 100 equal to 180. Subtracting the 100, I would be left with 8x is equal to 80, and then my last step would be to divide by 8, and I find that x is equal to 10. Okay, so we can just list off to the side then that the consecutive angles equal 180, or we can call them same side interiors also. Okay, on to the back page. On the back page, we have one more property that deals with parallelograms, just one. Okay. So from here, it says if a quadrilateral is a parallelogram, then the diagonals bisect each other. So diagonal meaning it goes from one corner to the other. These are my diagonals. And it's saying that they bisect each other. Bisect means that they cut each other in half. So that means QM, this segment here, would be the same as MS. And it also means that PM would have to be the same as MR because the diagonals bisect each other. Okay? So the first example says ABCD is a parallelogram. Find XC, AC, XB, and BD. Okay? If I mark my diagonals, these two are congruent, and these two are congruent. Okay? So when they ask me to find XC, XC is right here. It should be the same as XA. So I'm going to fill in XC is 10. And then they ask me to find AC. Well, if this segment is 10 and this segment is 10, 10 plus 10 would give me 20. Okay, on the other one, they asked me to find XB. Well, XB should be the same as XD, and since this one is 8, that means this one is 8. And then it asks for BD. Well, BD would be 8 plus 8, which gives me 16. On the next one, it says TUVW is a parallelogram, and this time they're telling us that this full length right here is 19. But what we know is that the diagonals bisect each other, so as this line cuts through, this little segment is the same as this one. So I know that this 19 is just going to get split in half. And I'm going to end up with 9.5. And that's going to be my value for TX. Okay. On the next one it says ABCD is a parallelogram. Find the values of X and Y. So I'm going to ask you, well, what are they labeling here? Are they labeling sides or angles or diagonals? On this one, they're labeling the sides, and we know that the opposite sides are congruent, which means I can say 5x plus 1 has to be equal to 26. They're across from each other. They're congruent to each other. I could also set up my second equation, which is going to be y is equal to 12 minus y. Okay, solving this first one here, I'm going to subtract 1, and I get 5x is equal to 25. When I divide by 5, I'm going to find that x is equal to 5. Okay, here, if I want to move this y over, I would have to add the y since it was a negative y right there. These would cancel out. Here I get 2y is equal to 12, and when I divide by 2, I'm going to find that y is equal to 6. Okay, on the next figure it says, use parallelogram AGEW to answer each question and then justify your answer. Now, they're not actually asking us to solve here. They just want to know, well, what is AW congruent to? Well, this side right here is congruent to the opposite side, so over here. So I'm going to say it's congruent to GE, and my reason is opposite sides are congruent. Okay, the next one says AC. Well, AC is part of the diagonal. Diagonals bisect each other. That means AC is congruent to CE. And we're going to say because the diagonals bisect each other. Okay, next one says angle AGE. Well, this angle here has to be congruent to this angle down here, this angle that's across from it or opposite of it. So I'm going to name that angle AWE. Remember, W is the angle we're looking at, so that vertex needs to go in the middle of the naming. And why are these two angles congruent to each other? We would say the opposite angles are congruent. Okay, next one says angle WCE. So if I trace WCE is going to be this angle right here. And WCE is going to be congruent to this angle up here. So I'm going to name that angle ACG. And why are these two angles congruent to each other? It's because they are vertical angles, and vertical angles are always congruent. So it's not a property of a parallelogram, but I know that vertical angles always have to be the same. Okay, number 12, looks like we're going to use that property of opposite sides are congruent. So we can say 2y plus 3 equals 15. We could also say 9 is equal to x plus 1. So if I subtract 3 here, I'm going to get 2y is equal to 12. When I divide by 2, I find y is equal to 6. Over here, if I subtract 1, I get 8 is equal to x. Okay? Now, number 13, not much for solving, but just applying those properties. So, like, I know A is going to be the same as the 12. So, A will equal 12. And B is going to be the same as this 7. So, B is equal to 7, and I have the same reason here. Opposite sides are congruent. Okay? X is going to equal 112, and my reason is going to be opposite angles are congruent. And then if I want to find Y, I know that the same side interiors or those consecutive angles have to be supplementary. So that means I take 180 and I subtract 112. I'm going to be left with 68 degrees, and that's going to be consecutive angles equal 180. They're supplementary. Okay? The last one says using this parallelogram MNPL, we're going to fill in the missing pieces here. We're going to look for the measures. Okay? So ML is actually congruent to NP. Opposite sides are congruent, so this is going to measure 12 meters. LP is going to be congruent to MN, which means it's going to measure 10 meters. QN is going to be congruent to QL, which means it's going to be 9 meters. Angle LPM, so angle LPM, this angle right here, is actually going to be congruent to this angle right here, because if these lines are parallel to each other, and this is my transversal, now I have a pair of alternate interior angles, and when the lines are parallel, alternate interior angles are congruent. So this is 62 degrees, and I could reference that if I want to. Alternate interior angles congruent. Okay, and then my last one, MLN, is going to be this angle right here. It should be the same as this angle right here, which is angle LNP, measures 32 degrees.